Want to know how to rewrite the British royal succession to the throne, who really controls the British monarchy, and how Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor could lose his place in the line of succession? If so, you're in the right place. In this episode of History Calling, I talk you through all the ways in which the line of succession to the English, Scottish and British thrones has been altered over more than a millennium, from violence to parliamentary legislation to just plain ignoring the legal heir because no one fancied having her as queen. I'll also explain how the former Prince Andrew, Duke of York, could lose his claim on the crown, why it could set some dangerous precedents for the modern monarchy that they might want to avoid, and what a possible alternative solution might be which would punish him but without going quite that far. To start, I'd like to draw a distinction between changing the line of succession and accelerating it. It is that distinction which is the reason that you won't hear me discuss some people you might have expected to hear about in this video. For example, when Edward II of England and Mary Queen of Scots were forced to abdicate in 1327 and 1567 respectively, their thrones went to their sons, Edward III and James VI, just as they would have done anyway if these boys had had to wait for their parent to die. The order of the succession wasn't changed in either case, and I'm generally only interested here in unexpected changes. I also don't have space to discuss every irregular succession in the history of the British Isles, and will just be giving some examples to support my points. However, if you do want a deep dive into all the English/British monarchs from 1066 onwards, I'll leave my 2 videos which cover them all linked below for you, as well as my video on the Scottish monarchy from 848 to 1625, by which point Scottish and English monarchies had combined. The first and historically most widely used method to alter the line of succession to the Scottish, English and British crowns was some good old-fashioned violence. Basically, you'd decide that you didn't like the person wearing the crown and that you could do it better. You'd then slaughter that person and take said crown, not necessarily in that order. Examples of this method include when King Hugh of Scotland was murdered and replaced by his cousin King Geric or Gregory in 878, when Constantine III of Scotland was murdered by his usurper Kenneth III in 997, when William the Conqueror killed King Harold Godwinson at the Battle of Hastings in 1066 and declared himself King of England, when Henry Bolingbroke deposed his cousin Richard II and had himself made Henry IV in 1399. Richard died soon afterwards in very fishy circumstances. When Edward IV twice deposed and ultimately killed King Henry VI in 1461 and 1471, when Edward's brother, Richard III, locked up and likely had his 2 young nephews killed so that they couldn't inherit the throne, and murdered/executed some of their prominent supporters too, and when Henry Tudor killed Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485 and became Henry VII. Some of you might also be thinking about King John, who arguably should have allowed his young nephew Arthur of Brittany to inherit the English throne after John's brother Richard the Lionheart died in 1199. However, succession rules were pretty flexible at that point, and Richard apparently named John as his successor, so I don't necessarily see this as a usurpation, though that does not mean that I'm okay with the fact that John likely murdered Arthur in 1203. It was nice if you could combine your violence with at least a veneer of legality. It just made everyone feel better about the fact that you were actually a conqueror and they were the conquered. And quite often we see this violent legality in action. William the Conqueror said that the throne had been left to him by Edward the Confessor, for instance, who was the guy who was king before Harold, and that this overrode any promises he might have subsequently made to Harold. Richard II was coerced into abdicating, though the next in line, if we were following the bloodline of his grandfather, still wouldn't have been Henry Bolingbroke, and Edward IV did actually have a better blood claim on the throne than Henry VI did. Richard III had his nephews, including Edward V, declared illegitimate, and said that even though one of his other nephews, a boy called Edward Earl of Warwick, should have been king in that instance, he didn't qualify because his father, Richard's other brother George Duke of Clarence, had been attainted and executed. Henry VII pretended that his reign started the day before Bosworth, and just to shore up his own and his children's position, he re-legitimised the surely deceased Edward V, which rendered Richard's reign illegal, along with all of Edward's siblings. He then married the dead king's eldest sister, who happened to be the person with the strongest blood claim on the crown still alive, Princess Elizabeth of York. We might call these actions some retroactive attempts at legality. Let's not forget the English Civil Wars and the ultimate execution of Charles I after a trial in January 1649 either. This didn't just reset the line of succession, it eliminated the whole monarchy, which had to be restored in 1660. But while Charles's son, Charles II, argued that he was king the whole time from the moment of his father's death onwards, in reality he held no power until 1660, and that is when his reign is dated from. It's due to this 11-year gap that I'm not viewing this episode as an example of accelerating the succession, because the entire institution went extinct for over a decade. Not all attempts at a violent resetting of the succession were successful. Charles II's oldest illegitimate son, James Duke of Monmouth, tried to depose his uncle James II in 1685, for instance, claiming that he was in fact legitimate to try to get that veneer of legality. He failed, and King James removed Duke James' head for his trouble. It's also preferable if you can seize a crown without having to kill the previous incumbent. It's quite rare, though. Empress Matilda, daughter of Henry I, was meant to become queen after her father died in 1135, but she was out of the country at the time, and her cousin, Stephen, nabbed the throne for himself. There followed many years of civil war known as the Anarchy, as they each tried to secure the crown, but neither killed the other, despite several opportunities, and eventually the throne went to Matilda's son, Henry II, restoring his grandfather's intended line of succession after a little detour. Another example is when Edward IV initially deposed Henry VI in 1461, but didn't kill him, even after he captured his rival king in 1465. Admittedly, this was likely for political reasons, as Henry's claim would have simply passed to his son, and King Edward would have looked like a monster. But when Henry's wife, Margaret of Anjou, managed to effect her husband's restoration, and Edward had to seize the crown for a second time, he wasn't so easygoing. In May 1471, with his only son already dead, Henry VI died in the Tower of London, surely under Edward's orders. Another way the succession could be changed without violence was to use Parliament, which is not to say that it wasn't also used after a violent takeover in order to rubber stamp the whole thing, but the following examples are Parliament only. As with the other methods of changing the succession that I'm talking about here, I don't have time to go through every instance where a piece of parliamentary legislation was passed in one of the three kingdoms or in the United Kingdom which sanctioned a usurpation or a change in the order of succession, but there are several very high-profile examples of parliamentary intervention that I'd like to draw your attention to. One, or rather three of them, are the multiple succession acts passed during the reign of Henry VIII. As you're probably aware, Henry had a very tangled marital history, which produced three surviving children who were considered legally legitimate in England at the times of their births. These were Princess Mary, born in 1516, Princess Elizabeth, born in 1533, and Prince Edward, born in 1537. The thing is, Henry annulled his first two marriages to Catherine of Aragon, Mary's mother, and Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth's mother, and this had the effect of delegitimizing these girls and removing them from the succession. The first Succession Act, passed in 1534 or 1533 according to the calendar in use at the time, was the one that officially removed Mary and added in Elizabeth in her place. The second, passed in 1536, removed Elizabeth and said that Henry could determine where the throne went with his last will and testament or letters patent. Flash forward a few years, and with just one son to his name, Henry decided it might be a good idea to put these daughters back into the line of succession, just as an insurance policy. Cue the Third Act of Succession, which passed through Parliament in 1544 and which ratified Henry's plan to put Mary and Elizabeth back in the line of succession after their younger brother, but without re-legitimizing either of them. The King's will also said that if all three of his children died without legitimate children of their own, which is exactly what happened, then the throne should go to the descendants of his younger sister, Mary Tudor Brandon, Dowager Queen of France and Duchess of Suffolk. That's not how it panned out, though. For a start, Henry's son, Edward VI, made a failed attempt to change the succession shortly before his death in 1553, using a document known as his Device for the Succession. This tried to skip over his sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, because Mary was Catholic and he saw them both as illegitimate, and go straight to the French Queen's senior surviving granddaughter, the Protestant Lady Jane Grey. To be fair, his father had indicated that monarchs had the power to choose their own successors, and Parliament had supported this right, so Edward's argument was that he'd inherited that power. However, with no parliamentary rubber stamp, even if that's all that it was, the device was of dubious legality, not helped by the fact that the king was a minor. After Edward died, Jane's father, the Duke of Suffolk, her father-in-law, the Duke of Northumberland, and other supporters attempted to make good on the device, but Mary Tudor was able to secure the throne for herself and ultimately had Northumberland, Jane, her husband Guildford Dudley, and the Duke of Suffolk executed. It wasn't the last time Henry's will was looked on with scorn, but the next attempt to circumvent it was much more successful. Before I give you all the juicy details, please remember to like, hype and comment on the video, and if you'd like to get more from me, you can become a YouTube member by clicking the join button under videos to get members only posts and badges next to your name in the comments, or head on over to patreon.com/historycalling, where I release even more bonus content, including extra podcasts and early access to ad-free videos. For those of you with Irish ancestry, there's also my book, Find Your Irish Ancestors Online, available from Amazon as an ebook and paperback and linked below. While you can get free bonuses if you join my mailing list on my website, historycallingofficial.com, after which you'll receive my newsletter plus 2 complimentary downloads. Just make sure to check that the newsletter is not going into your junk mail. Thank you too to those of you who support the channel using the thanks button under videos. When Elizabeth I died in 1603, the heir, according to her father's will, would have been a woman you may never have heard of, called Anne Stanley. But there was never any attempt to put her on the throne, and before anyone mentions the children of the French Queen's granddaughter, Lady Catherine Grey, they'd been declared illegitimate at that point. Instead, everyone who mattered pretty much agreed that they wanted the throne to go to the descendant of Henry VIII's older sister, Margaret Tudor. This was James VI of Scotland, and he became James I of England in a very smooth transfer of power. This is really quite an extraordinary turn of events. Yes, James had the better blood claim, he was male, Protestant, had rulership experience, and his accession would unite the English and Scottish crowns. But still, technically speaking, he wasn't the legal heir, and yet no one really gave a toss. Unlike Lady Jane Grey had been, he was the most popular candidate, and that's what sealed the deal. Even if Elizabeth had designated him on her deathbed, and we can't be sure she did, in her half-dead state and with no parliamentary legislation to back her up, it's a good thing no one challenged him, as the whole thing was a legal nightmare. Parliamentary involvement in the succession seemed to be becoming more important as the Tudor period progressed, except when it wasn't. Occasionally, a combination of initially non-violent conquest and parliamentary legislation were used. Think back to late 1688 when William of Orange, with the support of many prominent Englishmen, managed to take the British crown off his uncle/father-in-law James II. He really didn't want to kill him though, and instead let James escape to France. Had James not attempted to regain his throne, it's likely there would never have been any serious violence associated with the Glorious Revolution, which is sometimes inaccurately called the Bloodless Revolution. James did want that throne back, however, and that is how the pair wound up facing off at the Battle of the Boyne in Ireland in 1690. Spoiler alert, William won, and James and his male line descendants, known as the Jacobites, never got that crown back. I'll leave my video all about what happened to them instead, linked on screen and below for you. Where did Parliament come into this though? Well, this is where things get tricky. There was no Parliament in session at the time James left England to ratify the changes to the succession, and only the monarch could call one. Talk about a catch-22. Now, William was the de facto monarch, but not de jure. In other words, he wasn't legally in control yet, so he couldn't do it. There was a power vacuum. To solve it, MPs got together themselves in what is known as the Convention Parliament in January and February 1689 and asked William to call a proper parliament, as well as passing some other legislation, most notably the Bill of Rights. This stated that James had abdicated, asked that William and Mary be made joint king and queen with executive power vested in William for his lifetime. This is because Mary refused to be queen regnant unless he was king, and otherwise reduced the powers of the monarchy and increased those of Parliament. William then called a new Parliament which ratified what the Convention Parliament had done and passed the Crown and Parliament Recognition Act 1689. This confirmed that the crown now belonged to William and Mary, followed by any legitimate children they had, followed by any legitimate children Mary might have had if she outlived William, because as James II's daughter, her blood claim on the throne was stronger than his, or feeling that it went to Mary's sister Anne and any legitimate children she had, then any legitimate children of William's if he had any after Mary's death. Well done if you kept up with that. The Bill of Rights also excluded Roman Catholics from ever being able to hold the crown, as well as those married to Catholics. Of course, much like Henry VIII's various succession acts and the use of his will, the whole thing is a legal quagmire, because the Convention Parliament was technically illegal and so couldn't ratify William or Mary as monarchs, meaning they couldn't call a new parliament and ratify any of the Convention Parliament's acts, or anything else going forwards for that matter. My advice is to not think too hard about all of this though, or your head will explode. The legal gymnastics that got the Glorious Revolution over the finish line were more or less accepted at the time, so let's not try to unpick them now. Up in Scotland, by the way, the legislation which ratified the new succession there was called the Claim of Rights. As in England, it held that James had abdicated, which he hadn't, and offered the crown of Scotland to the new king and queen, who of course accepted. The critical thing I'd like you to remember from all this, though, is that the succession had now been determined by Parliament. They decided that James had abdicated, that the throne was vacant, and taken it upon themselves to offer it to William and Mary, whose claim then rested on the parliamentary legislation which cut King James and his son from the succession. This was different to, for example, Charles II, who was the next in line to his father's throne and who argued that he'd been king the whole time since his father's death. He wouldn't have recognised that the throne had been vacant, never mind non-existent. So 1688 to 1689 was indeed a revolutionary time. Whether it was glorious, though, I'll leave for you to decide. Now, William, Mary and Anne didn't have any surviving children, and so in 1701, with Anne's last child dead and no real hope of any more, Parliament had to step in again to prevent the crown reverting to the Jacobite line. The Act of Settlement stipulated that if William and Anne both died without legitimate issue, the throne would now go to Sophia, Electress of Hanover, who was a Protestant descendant of James I, followed in turn by her own legitimate Protestant descendants. The legal union between Scotland and the rest of the British Isles in 1707 meant that the Act covered the Scottish crown too. This is what happened in 1714 when Sophia's son George I became king, and his descendants are still on the throne today. For over 200 years after George I's succession, the crown then descended through the expected line according to male first order primogeniture. Then, in 1936, a little event called the abdication crisis occurred. This was precipitated by King Edward VIII inheriting the throne from his father George V in January 1936. Edward, though, was in love with an American divorcee named Wallis Simpson, but as the head of the English Church, he couldn't marry her, as both her previous husbands were still alive. This prompted him to abdicate that December, allowing the throne to pass to his brother, known as Bertie, but who took the regnal name George VI. The abdication crisis also meant that some serious parliamentary legislation was needed to keep everything legal. This legislation is called His Majesty's Declaration of Abdication Act 1936. It stated that once he signed it, which was on the 11th of December, shortly before he made his famous abdication speech on the radio, Edward would cease being king, he and his descendants would no longer be entitled to the throne, and he would no longer be subject to the 1772 Royal Marriages Act, which would of course mean that he could marry Wallis. Had he had any children, it wouldn't have applied to them either, by the way. It also said that the crown would go to the member of the royal family then next in succession to the throne, i.e. his brother Bertie, and specified too that the Commonwealth countries of Canada, Australia, New Zealand and South Africa had all agreed to the abdication legislation. Now, interestingly enough, we could argue that this example shouldn't be in this video, because even if Edward had married Wallis and stayed king, he had no children, and so upon his death in 1972, the throne would still have ended up with his niece, Queen Elizabeth II. Was this an acceleration of the succession then, rather than a change? Maybe, yes, but there's also the possibility that if he'd stayed king, something would have happened which would have ended his marriage to Wallis earlier, and he might have married again and reproduced, so I've decided to leave it in. Plus, it's just so famous that I thought there'd be a riot in the comments if I left it out. We now move on to the year 2013 and the Succession to the Crown Act. It dropped male primogeniture for anyone born after the 28th of October 2011 and instead instituted absolute primogeniture. In other words, no more special treatment for boys. People are in line to the throne according to birth order, irrespective of gender. This meant that when Prince Louis was born in 2018, he did not overtake his older sister, Princess Charlotte, born in 2015, in the line of succession. It also eliminated the exclusion of people from the line of succession because they are married to a Catholic, and applied this retroactively as long as the people concerned were still alive. This had the effect of putting Prince Michael of Kent back into the line, as he had lost his claim upon his marriage to the Catholic Baroness Marie Christine von Reibnitz in 1978. It remains the law, though, that the monarch themselves cannot be a Catholic. In fact, they have to be Church of England, though the most senior former claimant to the crown who is disqualified for this reason is Lord Downpatrick, heir to the Duke of Kent, and he would only be 44th at the time of making this video, so I can see why it didn't stop him converting when he was a teenager. The Succession to the Crown Act also repealed the Royal Marriages Act of 1772 and limited the number of people requiring the monarch's consent for their marriages to the first 6 in line to the throne, which means more people are free to marry where they wish and their children can hold a place in the line of succession. Now we come to Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor. After his arrest on his 66th birthday, the 19th of February 2026, on suspicion of misconduct in a public office during his time as a UK trade envoy between 2001 and 2011, and on the back of many years of scandals around him concerning his links with disgraced American financier Jeffrey Epstein and his treatment of the late Virginia Giuffre, the UK government are now looking at removing him from the line of succession, something which would also require the consent of the Commonwealth nations. As of recording this video, he currently ranks number 8, despite having been stripped of all his titles near the end of 2025. If this happens, it will be an incredibly unusual situation, and it raises all sorts of headache-inducing questions for the British and Commonwealth governments and the royal family itself. For instance, will Andrew's daughters and grandchildren be affected, or will the legislation just carve him out of the line with surgical precision and leave everyone else in it alone? Timing is also important. If this happens, will it only be if he is convicted in a court of law of a crime? Because at the moment he never has been, and in the UK there is a presumption of innocence until you are proven guilty. What if he's never found guilty of any crime? Will this idea simply be dropped? If he is removed, what will the official reason given be? If it's having a conviction of any kind, that's a dangerous precedent to set for other members of the family. For instance, would it mean that a minor conviction for something like slight speeding that didn't result in any harm could cost you your chance at the throne? If that was the case, Princess Anne would be out. Will any act which removes him need to state a specific list of crimes which can cost you that place? And if so, what's on the list and who gets to choose what's on the list? If it's because he's already brought shame to the monarchy, again, that could be a dangerous precedent. Who gets to decide what behaviour is bad enough to warrant being cut from the succession? We all know Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex's reputation is now in the toilet compared to where he was in 2019, but while I find the airing of his own and his family's dirty laundry to the world to be very distasteful, It's not actually a crime, and I don't think we want a situation where future royals can't call out each other's bad behaviour or what they perceive as bad behaviour for fear it will lead to elimination from the line of succession for them and their descendants. After all, what about freedom of speech and more transparency in the institution? We don't want this to be a popularity contest either. Back in the 1990s, many people were calling for the then Prince Charles to be cut from the succession because he cheated on his first wife Diana, and his popularity was at an all-time low. It only sank further after Diana's death. He hadn't committed any crime though, and public opinion can often be at worst fickle and at best malleable. Flash forward to today, and he's in a very successful marriage with Queen Camilla, and they are generally thought to be doing a good job as king and consort. We'd have missed out on a good monarch if the anti-Charles Brigade had had their way, and Prince William would have had to become king much younger, while Princess Catherine would have had to deal with her cancer whilst being queen at the same time. Andrew would also be even higher up the succession. I'm all for the monarchy setting a good example and being subject to the same laws as the rest of us, but we need to accept they won't always act in the way that we want them to, and sometimes they'll make mistakes. I don't think we want to risk throwing the whole institution down the drain because of the actions of one bad apple, or issues in people's private lives which are not criminal and don't affect their ability to do the job. None of this is said in support of Andrew, I hasten to add, but rather of the long-term survival of the firm as a whole, which he has already damaged so much. Public hysteria shouldn't always be allowed to dictate policy, and it's important to have cooler heads in charge who think more than one step or one PR crisis ahead and consider the potential long-term effects of messing with the established order if it's not absolutely necessary. Again, this doesn't mean I like Andrew or even that I don't want him to be given the boot, but he's so far down the line that I think it's a purely symbolic act. I cannot conceive of any scenario in which those ahead of him would all be wiped out, for the simple reason that they're almost never even on the same continent as each other, let alone the same building. With the Sussexes living in California and the Prince and Princess of Wales and their children in England, what could possibly happen that would leave Andrew as king or heir apparent? Is such a symbolic act worth risking the solidity of the monarchy as a whole? We don't want a repeat of the Jacobite situation at some point in the future, where Parliament forcibly cut out someone who otherwise would have held the crown, leading to over a century of rival claims, rebellions, and general instability. I just think we need to tread carefully and make sure we don't cut off our nose to spite our face. Removing him could also be a problem if we get a very pro-Republican government in power who seek to use the ability to artificially disrupt the line of succession by taking people out of it in order to control, manipulate, or destroy the monarchy. That has shades of what happened in 1649 when the parliamentarians decided to get rid of the monarchy, but many people in the country didn't want that to happen and were only too happy to get the dead king's son back just over a decade later. In short, there is a lot to consider, and I'd like to emphasise that I'm just asking questions at this point. I am not claiming to have all the answers. These are topics that I think need to be thought about and discussed, though, to avoid future problems, but a lot of the hysterics I see on the internet screaming about the situation don't seem to be doing that. If the government and the royals wanted to do something to punish Andrew and further limit his already very weak chance of ever taking the crown, but didn't fancy going as far as eliminating him entirely and setting the precedents I've mentioned, I do have another suggestion which is somewhere in the middle. I told you that the Succession to the Crown Act of 2013, which allows girls to retain their position in the succession ahead of younger brothers, only applies to girls born after the 20th of October 2011. If it was extended to cover girls born on or after the 15th of August 1950, though, then Princess Anne, her 2 children and her 5 grandchildren would all overtake Andrew, pushing him down to number 16 by my count. I doubt this will happen, as I think we're looking at an elimination, which is fine by me as long as it's very carefully worded so that the legislation can't be abused in the future or used as a precedent to create other abusive legislation, but I thought I'd throw it out there. It would also have the advantage of being very progressive. Why should Anne be lower than Andrew just because she doesn't have a Y chromosome after all? It's not like having one makes a person any brighter, better, or more hard-working. Andrew's got one, and I think he's a moron. Also, as someone with no Y chromosome myself, I just take it all a bit personally. I hope you enjoyed my summary of the different ways in which the line of succession can and has been changed in the British Isles over the past 1,000 years or so, and the examples I gave for each type of change. Let me know below if you think Andrew should be formally removed from the line of succession, and for more on the history of the Scottish, English and British monarchies, see one of these videos next. Until next time all, keep learning.